Power creep is a term used to describe how a card is better than another card in nearly everything that it does. So in this list, we'll be going over the 10 best cards that have power crept the card Silverback Patriarch over the years, a card used as the benchmark for power creep as it was added in the first set. And at number 10, we have Wormrest Agent. This priest minion gains 1 attack and taunt if you're holding a dragon in your hand. But if you didn't, then this minion is just a 2 mana 1/4 with no effects. So it's not always better, since if you don't have a dragon in hand, it can be a silverback without a taunt or better stats. Even still, this card was the first widely played Powercrept Silverback Patriarch and saw its home in old school Dragon Priest decks. Back in the day, the plan was to spend as much mana as you could on overstated cards that benefited from dragon synergy, with the dream curve being, with at least another dragon in your hand, to play Twilight Whelp on 1 mana, Wormrest Agent on 2, and Dark Cultist on 3. At the time, there were a few ways to effectively destroy these minions with spells, and they either cost too much to use or wouldn't even kill most of the Dragon Priest minions, like Wormrest Agent. Also, back then, there were a few other well-statted cheap minions that could contest Wormrest Agent while on the board. Minion combat was really important and spells weren't quite as good as they are now. So Priest really benefited from gaining value by using their hero power to keep their minions alive, since they had so few ways of drawing cards. By using high health, overstated minions like Wormrest Agent, they could kill other minions and heal with their hero power to gain card advantage. Wormrest Agent was a staple in all Dragon Priest deck variants, and all of this helped it to become a dominant tempo deck. Over time though, newer, more powerful archetypes have come out and the meta has evolved to the point where decks are very reliant on card synergies. New dragon synergies have come out in the past, and even when they were competitive, they played as slow as control decks rather than as tempo dragon decks. And that's why Wormrest Agent took the number 10 spot on this list. Although it did see a lot of play in the past, it fell out of favor because it was tied to a class-specific archetype that didn't receive enough support over the years to remain competitive. And at number 9, we have Phantom Militia. This card is a neutral 3 mana 2/4 minion with Taunt and Echo, which means you get an extra copy of this card in your hand when you play it until the end of your turn. So you could play one of them for 3 mana, 2 for 6 mana, or 3 for 9 mana, but the extra copy in your hand will disappear after you end your turn. This card was played in a Quest Warrior deck and was used to fulfill its requirements. The quest, which always starts in your opening hand, requires you to play 7 taunt minions to add Sulfurs to your hand, which sets your hero power to do 8 damage to a random enemy for 2 mana. This quest deck was quite good at the time. The only issue is that it required you to play taunt minions, not summon. You see, in Hearthstone, play means to spend the mana from your hand to add a minion to the board. Summon means to create/bring a minion out in some other way. That means even though the cards like Protect the King seems like the taunt minions it creates could fulfill the quest conditions, they don't because they summon. That means that any taunt cards that could add other taunt cards to your hand were extremely useful, since otherwise you would have to rely on your normal draw for the taunt minions you needed, or sit there doing nothing if you didn't draw any. So to fulfill the warrior quest and basically win the game within a couple of turns, you could summon echoed copies of Phantom Militia to get up to 3 quest ticks with 1 card, instead of 1. It's worth noting that the new card, Scrapsmith, is just the Powercrept Phantom Militia, since the minions added to your hand don't disappear after you play it. But neither of these cards see play anyways, since Quest Warrior and Taunt Warrior are seen as a meme deck now. And at number 8, we have Hot Spring Guardian. This card is a 3 mana 2/3 with Taunt, which restores 3 health whenever you play it. And unlike the previous 2 entries, this card is an elemental and has a tribe tag, like Silverback Patriarch. It's worth noting though, that tribal tags aren't good and aren't worth playing any mana just to have, unless your deck is specifically built around it and has synergies associated with it, since they can interfere with your other combos or can be easily countered. Luckily though, the elementals enjoy an only beneficial synergies and have no specific tribal counter cards. At first, this card was played in elemental decks and helped stop early aggression, heal out of direct damage range, and gain value by healing damage-friendly minions. The mechanic in elemental decks at the time was if you played an elemental last turn, meaning if you had played, not summoned, at least 1 elemental last turn, you would get the extra effect on the card. So the best way to play these kinds of decks was just to play 1 good elemental every turn, so that you would always have their effects active. Surprisingly, this card was actually used for its taunt and for its battle cry, even in non-elemental control shaman decks. The thing is, in the standard format at the time, the shaman had just lost a lot of its good removal and healing cards while gaining good, but not very expensive removal. And that's why Hot Spring Guardian is at the number 8 spot. It offered what both of these types of shamans needed against aggressive decks at the time: cheap healing and a good taunt minion to contest the board. And speaking of minions with good stats for its cost. And at number 7, we have Fierce Monkey. This card is just a 3 mana, 3/4 warrior minion with taunt and is a beast. This was the first minion to spawn the meme of Blizzard power creeping bad cards, but I'm not really sure why. Maybe because Silverback Patriarch was a hilariously bad basic set card, or because both are primates and do basically the same thing. This card saw its home in Dragon Warrior of all places, and saw play until the introduction of Standard. Dragon Warrior decks basically ran as many high-statted, no-drawback minions it could to create tempo and overwhelm the opponent before they could clear out all of their minions off the board. But despite the name, Dragon Warrior only ran just enough dragons, usually only 7, so they could play Alexstrasza's Champion on 2 mana consistently, so they could play a 3/3 with charge. It's also worth noting that a lot of Warrior's only good tempo minions cost 3 mana. Back in the day, there were very few minions that had both stats above its cost and had a positive effect like Fierce Monkey. The taunt was sometimes useful though to protect your early minions, like N'Zoth's First Mate or Fairy Dragon, but it was the beefy attack and health that proved too much aggression for some decks to handle. The fact that the Fierce Monkey, despite having no taunt or beast synergy with the deck, was played as a 2 of in most Tempo Warriors and Dragon Warriors proved how powerful a 3 mana 3/4 was at the time. And at number 6, we have Arcspore msshi'fn. msshi'fn is a 3 mana 3/4 with taunt that shuffles a msshi'fn Prime into your deck. The Prime version of this card is a 10 mana 9/9 that lets you summon either an additional 9/9 with Rush or with Taunt. This card came out with the other Prime cards, which were mostly not awful to play, even nowadays. The Prime's gimmick is that an expensive, very good version of themselves is put into your deck, with the drawback that it might be too expensive to play, or you may never draw it in time by the time the game ends. msshi'fn saw play in a Taunt Druid deck because it was one of the best taunt minions with good stats and its beneficial death rattle that could potentially win some matches when played. This deck hoped to play Razormane Battleguard, which reduced the cost of your next taunt minion by 2 mana, and play msshi'fn or other good taunts, usually on turn 2 or 3. This deck would then snowball by playing buffs on their battle guards or taunts, and end the game with very cheap Grey Bows, or in some cases, a cheap 8 mana msshi'fn Prime. In fact, this is a first card on this list to see some play in Wild, which is a mode where all cards are allowed, albeit not very much. The only place where it was played was in Hadronox Druid, and actually because it has taunt. You see, Hadronox is a card that lets you summon every unique taunt minion that died this game, and is a beast. What makes this deck somewhat annoying even to this day is its ability to resummon Hadronox up to 5 more times per game with N'Zoth the Corruptor and Witching Hour, when it was originally bounced around only being able to die once. And since msshi'fn isn't a beast like Silverback Patriarch, it doesn't mess up your beast pool, which allows you to resummon Hadronox for only 3 mana. It also lets you shuffle in a huge taunt minion each time it's summoned by Hadronox, but since Hadronox Druid is slow, grindy deck, it actually values shuffling cards so as to not die from fatigue before their opponent, more than actually playing the Prime version. And speaking of cards that were played in that deck, and at number 5 we have Dreaming Drake. This card is a 3 mana 3/4 dragon which, when you play a card that costs 4 or more, gains +2/+2 while it's in your hand. This card has the same stats as the previous entry, but has that very relevant dragon tag. So even though I said earlier that having a tag isn't that important, at the time, Breath of Dreams was in rotation and was considered to be one of the best mana ramping cards ever. Breath of Dreams lets you draw a card, but if you're holding the dragon, you get to also gain an empty mana crystal. For reference, Wild Growth, a card that only lets you gain an extra mana crystal, was so good that it had to be nerfed to 3 mana. Breath of Dreams does that for 2 mana and is card neutral, but only if you had a dragon in your hand. That wasn't a problem though, since Blizzard also printed some of the best minions in a long time into the standard format, which, hey, would you look at that, happened to be dragons. Ysera is a 9 mana 4/12 which shuffles cards into your deck that summon any random dragon when drawn. This deck basically aimed to play Ysera as fast as possible and win with the immense value her portals would create, since again, all these dragons in the set were gigantic and had amazing effects. Also, since all of the cards in this deck were really expensive, it was very easy to corrupt Dreaming Drake to also become a 3 mana threat. Somehow on this list, we ended up talking about a third different dragon deck about Silverback Patriarch, but it also saw play in Hadronox deck that msshi'fn was in too. Since Dreaming Drake isn't a beast that could mess with the Witching Hour, and was played in an expensive deck, it was easy to play and resummon its corrupted version with Hadronox over and over. It just ekes out over msshi'fn though, since Dreaming Drake was slightly more meta-defining and sees slightly more play in niche wild decks, like in tribal N'Zoth decks. And at number 4, we have the Stonehill Defender. This card is a 3-mana 1/4, which lets you discover a taunt minion, which means you get an option to choose one of 3 random taunt minions to add to your hand, but only from your class. This card was known as one of the best generic cards in the set, because of the sheer versatility and high power level of some of the class-specific taunt cards. When you discover a taunt off of Stonehill Defender, you also have a higher chance of getting a class-specific taunt minion. That meant it was great in Arena, where you could easily discover a game-winning large taunt, a legendary, or just another cheap taunt to help you survive for that turn. This card also helped to activate the Warrior quest too, and it was a great card to draw since you could pick whatever card best fit your needs. Even though it had a chance to only hit bad taunts or taunts that you didn't need, it could also discover itself so that you could potentially play infinite Stonehill Defenders, since it also had taunt. This did help with the quest since it didn't lose you any card advantage, but was a tad too slow for the meta, since playing Silverback Patriarch and stats to stop aggro druid, or pirate decks did almost nothing to stop their aggression. Where it did find its home though was in Token Shaman. This deck aimed to make as many token minions as possible, and used Shaman's good attack buff cards to quickly close out the game. It also used Evolve, a card which would transform all of your minions into new ones that cost 1 more mana. So one of the combos would be to reduce the cost of Thing from Below or play Doppelgangster with Evolve to either get a cheap 7 mana minion or 3 6-cost minions. So how did Stonehill Defender fit into all of this? Shaman at the time still had a really bad card draw and would run out of steam really quickly, so much so that it would run Mana Tide Totem, a card that most would consider pretty subpar. But Stonehill had the chance to discover Thing from Below, one of Shaman's best cards of all time, and could usually survive on board long enough to be played with Evolve to become a random 4-cost minion. Later on, it would see niche play in different forms of Reno decks, since they needed 30 unique cards in their deck, usually in the form as anti-aggro or as value-generating cards, both of which Stonehill could do. And at number 3, we have Gnomergon Infantry. This minion is a 3-mana 1/4, just like Silverback Patriarch, but it has Charge too, which lets it attack immediately when it's played. Even though Wormrest Agent was the first conditional card that Powercrept Silverback, Gnomergon Infantry was the first unconditional better Silverback Patriarch. So, was it any good? No. When it was first released, it was seen as complete garbage, and rightfully so. The best charge minions have high attack with as little health as possible, so that it could act as direct damage from the hand. But Gnomergon Infantry had a pitiful 1 attack that would usually not kill or threaten anything, and had so little health as a taunt minion that it would usually be cleared by the next turn. It was kind of the worst of both worlds, having too little attack to use its offensive keyword, and too little health to use its defensive keyword. However, this card has seen a massive resurgence in the past couple of years as a key combo piece in very potent anti-meta decks. The deck, called Math or Inner Fire Priest, aims to 1-turn kill their opponent by stacking a ton of buffs onto Gnomergon Infantry and charge it in for lethal. So, why this card? Of all of the charge minions which are available to priests, which are only neutrals I might add, Gnomergon Infantry actually has the highest health of all charge minions, and is still relatively cheap for combos. Its health is actually important because what you would do is use cards like Power Word Fortitude and Power Word Shield to increase its health, double it with Divine Spirit, set its attack equal to its health with Topsy-Turvy, Bless, or Inner Fire, and attack immediately into your opponent for over 30 attack, since Gnomergon Infantry has Charge. Cards like Insight and Shadow Visions help you find your combo faster, and can even kill the opponent as soon as turn 5. Inner Fire Priest has long been known as the meta killer since it preys on decks that are too slow or anti-aggro heavy, and Gnomergon Infantry helped land Divine Spirit into the Hall of Fame, Hearthstone's equivalent of a ban list. But because Blizzard decided to add Charge, presumably as a joke, to Silverback Patriarch, this card sees a large amount of play in specific and nichely powerful decks. And at number 2, we have Death's Head Cultist. This card is a 3-mana 2/4 Quillbore with Taunt, and when it dies, restores 4 health to your hero. And funnily enough, this card saw play because of all of its attributes since it had Taunt, was a cheap good death rattle minion, and was a Quillbore. This card is simply one of the best anti-aggro taunt minions of all time. It has pretty good stats for a taunt minion, and it has a death rattle that restores health to your hero rather than a battle cry. When we compare this card to Hot Spring Guardian, it may not seem especially obvious why on-death healing is better than immediate healing, but that's because the ability to target friendly minions for healing is almost never used, and because sometimes when you play Hot Spring Guardian, you need the taunt to contest the board, but waste its heal. With Death's Head, you get more healing, which is actually quite relevant, and have the option to hurt your hero first, like with Life Tap or by attacking into a minion, so you can get the maximum value off of its death rattle. That alone makes it great in generic control or combo decks. But where it really shines is when it can use its taunt and death rattle. Taunt Druid at the time needed enough taunt minions in their deck so that if the Battle Guard were to survive, they could play a reduced cost taunt every turn until they completely overwhelmed their opponent. It also saw play in Death Rattle Demon Hunter as their premier death rattle. At the time, the deck had Razor Boar and Razor Fen Beastmaster, which would summon a death rattle minion from your hand that cost 3 or less mana, or 4 or less mana from your hand, respectively. These cards were great and had more support cards to go along with them. The only issue being that Demon Hunter only had 2 good death rattles in the rotation at the time, Death's Head Cultist and Renowned Performer. But in Wild, with every good neutral death rattle from every expansion at their disposal, Death Rattle Demon Hunter had enough good options, like Bad Luck Albatross and Rotten Applebomb, to be a serious threat with all the new synergies. And throughout its time in Standard and Wild, Death's Head Cultist remained a staple the whole time, because of how much faster and common aggro decks were becoming in both of these formats. Especially in Wild, with most aggro decks being able to play a 1-mana pirate with patches and get some early chip damage in. There was almost never a case where Death's Head Death Rattle healing would be wasted by turn 3. Also, with the fairly recent introduction of the Quillboar Tribe, that meant they would be eligible for Resurrection by N'Zoth decks, since the card would resummon a minion from each tribe that died that game. And since it was already played as a pretty common anti-aggro card, it fit right in as another card to be res by N'Zoth. So with all of its positive interactions in so many good decks and amazing overstated stats as an anti-aggro tool, this version of Silverback Patriarch earns its number 2 spot. However, it isn't quite as good as our next card, which actually has the opposite effect. And at number 1, we have Vulgar Homunculus. This card is a Warlock 2-mana, 2/4 minion, so stronger and cheaper version of Silverback Patriarch, that deals 2 damage to your hero when it's played. At first glance, this card may seem unreasonable and not worth its slightly overstated body for its cost, especially with how much Warlocks tend to damage themselves with their hero power. You may be surprised to hear this though, that this card found competitive success nearly the entire time it's been out in the game. When it was first released, it was a staple card in nearly every single Zoolock deck out there. Zoolock is a deck that aims to play as many cheap minions as possible, refuel them with their hero power, and close the game out with direct damage. Homunculus fit the game plan perfectly as an overstated minion with a minor downside, because Zoolock didn't care about the damage to themselves. Instead, they cared more about making threatening boards as quickly as possible and ending the game before they could do anything. You see, your hero's health doesn't actually matter unless your opponent can burst you down with direct damage. So Warlock decks often use their health pool to gain mana or card advantage. While Zoo isn't really a typical aggro deck, it does tend to be the one pushing the initiative, and as such, their opponents can't usually stick minions on the board or gather a combo long enough to take advantage of their self-damaging effects before Zoo kills them. In recent years, Zoo has all but vanished due to board clears, healing, and single target removal being Powercrept over the years, but it has found its home in some even lock decks, which gets its name for only playing even cost cards and making their hero power cost 1 mana with the effect of Gen Greymane. This deck plays very similar to old school handlock decks, where you abuse your cheapened hero power to draw a ton of cards and lose a ton of life and play cards that synergize off of that. Sometimes by turn 3, they'd be able to play Mountain Giants, or if they were facing a fast aggro deck, play Molten Giants and Faceless Shambler. The thing is though, most aggro decks are fast enough where they could just ignore the Giants played and go for lethal. So Vulgar Homunculus acted as an amazing anti-aggro tool that also synergized with their other self-damaging cards. Later on, Homunculus' self-damaging drawback once again landed into one of Hearthstone's best decks of all time, Dark Glare Zoolock. When this card first came out, it was a 3-mana 3/4 that restored 2 mana crystals whenever your hero took damage. The combo with this card, usually as early as turn 3, would be to play Dark Glare and as many cards that damage you and cost 2 mana or less, since they would basically cost no mana. Cards like Kobold Librarian and Raise Dead would draw cards and gain you mana, Spirit Bomb and Crystallizer would lower your life points for free, and Vulgar Homunculus as a free 2/4. The payoff would be to play a couple of Molten Giants or Flesh Giants for as cheap as possible and go for lethal in a few turns. This combo was so devastating at high ladder that the few people who did manage to master it ended up with over 70% win rates, which was unheard of even today. And even with all of this self-damage, other decks weren't able to deal 10 damage from hand on turn 4, especially with Vulgar Homunculus in a way to stop charge minions. This card definitely deserves to be the best Powercrept version of Silverback Patriarch, because of how often it was played, and how its downside actually became a core reason as to why it became good so many years later. Alright, and that's the video. If you know of any other cards that should have definitely been on this list, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.